After looking at loops, now we're going to look at how to write functions in Python. And we're going to look at how to write functions in Python from first principles. So by the end of this video, you will understand what a function is and why it is useful. We're going to learn how to define and call functions in Python. We're also going to grasp all the concepts around functions, like what parameters are, what arguments are, and how to return values in functions. And we are also going to just make sure that you're able to write clean, reusable code using functions. Now, what is a function? So, a function is a named block of code that performs a specific task. So, this is really key to understand, performing a specific task. So, instead of writing the same code over and over again, you can write this code once inside a function and you can reuse it elsewhere using this function. A good example that I can think of is in the previous video, we talked about the random module, right? So the random module, we're able to import it and reuse it anywhere that we want because it is implemented as a function. But before we get into just building such big libraries and modules, we're going to look at how to write basic functions. A sort of other thing that can help you understand this better is I'd like you to think of a blender. So when you're using a blender, let's say you want to make a smoothie, the first thing that you'll do is you'll put in the ingredients, and then you'll press the button, and you'll get a smoothie, right? So putting in the ingredients are the inputs that your function requires, and pressing a button, the button on the blender, that is a function call. Remember, this is a functionality of the blender. So that is a function call that you make so that it can be able to mix the ingredients, and the output that you get out of this blender is the smoothie that you made, right? So you've made an input, you've made a function call, and you've gotten an output. That is ideally how functions work. And I'd also like you to imagine of, let's say you have a recipe, and your recipe is sort of reused across multiple pages in a cookbook that you're working with. So now I want you to imagine copying the same recipe in every page of your cookbook, right? So that is a lot of repetition, wastes a lot of time. It's not even efficient. So what you can do to try and solve that is you can write the recipe at one point. So let's say the first page of the book, and you're going to call this recipe something like grandma's recipe. And in every other page where you need that recipe, you will just call the grandma's recipe. So you'll have a sort of statement that says call grandma's recipe at every point where it is needed. So you don't have to repeat the entire recipe, but that statement alone is a reference point for you to go back to the recipe, the grandma's recipe that you had in the beginning. Now that we understand how that what a function is and all that makes sense, let's go ahead and write some code. So I've created a file here. I've called it functions.py, and I'd like us to start with the basic syntax of a function. So to write a function, you just use def and space, then you write a function name, right? So again, this is I'm just writing this like that. So you'll have a function name, and you'll have a full colon right there, and this is where now your code block comes in. So let's call this again. This is just some sort of logic that your application needs, right? So that is what you write there. An example of how you can write this, the function name, you're not restricted to writing to any name, so you have to think of a name for you to use. But the rules that we mentioned in the beginning of not using the reserved keywords in Python still do apply here. But let's assume you want to write a simple function to greet a person. So I'm going to call that function greet, and the kind of code block that you can have here, for example, you just want to print a statement that says hello world. So you'll just write the hello world. Now you have a function, and you have a code block that is going to be executed. Once you've done this, the other thing that you do next is you have to call the function for it to work. So remember what you mentioned, whenever you want to make a smoothie, well, you need to make a function call on your blender, which is pressing on a button, or basically yeah, so depending on how your blender works, by the way. And so let's call the function. So you call the function name here greet, and you have to have the set of parentheses there at the end. So once you call this, you're going to get an output, right? So let's run this code, and then we can go over it again. We'll just type in python 3. The name of this is function.py. You hit enter, and you can see it gives us what the function does, or in this case the statement, which is hello world, that you can see here. So this is what happens in this case. The def keyword that we have here, this is the one that tells Python that you are defining a function. Greet is the function name. So this is just a label and you are free to choose a name of your choice. So again, it's going to be dependent on the kind of function that you have to write. The same way that for you to pick a variable name, you'll pick a variable name that is suitable to or descriptive enough of what you're trying to define or store in that variable. So the same thing applies here. And the set of parentheses that we have here, this is for inputs. Remember, we mentioned in your Blender, you're going to require some inputs. So this is for inputs, and we're going to get into this later on. Then you need to do indentation. So you can see this indentation that we have here. This is usually one tab or four spaces, right? Then you have this here. So the indented block, this is where the code runs. Indentation is really, really important in Python. Without indentation, you're going to get some errors. So there are always indentation errors in Python. So for example, if I do this and I run this code, you see what I get? I get an indentation error. And it tells me that it expected an indented block after the function definition in line 1. Again, descriptive enough for you to tell you that there's an indentation that you're missing here. So you can just do one tab, or you can do 4 spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. And that should be enough. So then now let's look at how you can add inputs into your function. Like you've mentioned, we use these parentheses to add inputs to our function. So in this case, the function is just printing a statement. But what about if you wanted to specifically mention the name of a person? Like you can say, hi, Jake, hi, Paul, something like that. So that is where a parameter comes in. So in here, I'm actually going to just redefine what you had earlier on. So you have the def keyword, then you'll have a function name. This is just the syntax that I'm writing here. You'll have a function name, and now you'll have a set of parentheses. This is where parameters come in. So parameters are the inputs that your function needs or requires for it to run. And then here, this is where now your code block comes in. So code block comes in here. Again, I'm going to just comment this out, but we're going to reference to it at any time that we need to. So we have a function called greet, then we're going to give it parameters. Again, parameters, these are inputs that your function needs for it to work. In this case, we want to say hello and then the name of the person. So you can pass in name. Again, you usually pass in a variable. Then you pass in name. This is the name that you're going to give. And when you are greeting the person, I'm going to just use a simple F string here. I'm going to say hello, then we'll pass in the name parameter that we have here. So that is a parameter. Then when we are calling our function now, you can see we have this highlights an error here. This is because when you're calling the function and it requires parameters, you have to pass in the actual values for this parameter. These actual values, usually refer to them as arguments. So what goes during the function definition, remember this first line here is function definition. So during function definition, this is when we have parameters. But when you're doing a function call, which is what you're doing here, so this is a function call, where the values that you pass in here, we call them arguments. So the argument they're passing is the name of a person. So we can pass in a name like, let's say, Jen, right? Like that. Now, if we go ahead and run our code, I'm going to run this. You see, it says, hello, Jen. It picks up this here. So it picks up Jen, then it gets passed in here to the function definition. And because our function uses that parameter, it gets passed in here. And you can see that flow and how it works there. So in this case, the parameter is the placeholder inside a function, and an argument is the actual value that you pass when you're calling the function. So the actual value that you pass when you're calling a function, you're not really restricted to just hard coding it like this. You can be a little bit more creative. I'm sure you've already figured this out up to this point. You can get an input from a user, right? So you can just, again, have name as the variable, as a variable there. Then you're going to get an input from a user. Then you're going to say, enter a name. Just like that. Then when you're calling the function now, you'll pass in this variable name here. You'll pass in the variable. So how this is going to work is you're first going to, this is going to be prompted to give a name. Then once you provide that name is going to be passed in here to this greet function call. And that exact name is also going to go here again up to this point. So if you run the code here, it says enter a name. So let me say enter a name like Jude. I hit enter, you see it says hello Jude. Again, you can be able to play around with this as many times as you'd like to. Now, we've understood a simple way to write a function, how to manipulate a function, simply how to get an input from a user and pass in parameters and arguments. But we can even extend this further other than what you've done so far, where sometimes you find that a function needs to give something back. At this point, this function is not giving anything back. It is just printing something out. So a function needs to give something back. And to do that, this is where we need to return values, right? So at this point, I need to explain a specific concept. So whenever you're using a print statement, or whenever a function is printing something, instead of giving or rather returning something or giving something back, the function gets terminated after it has been executed, right? So once a function like this basically give the output, gets terminated, nothing else, like you, it gets discarded afterwards, right? So that's why you still have to do like another function call every time that you want to use it. So to help us understand how that is done, I'm going to write something else. So I'm going to just comment this out, and then we're going to write another function here. So we're going to write a simple function, and we're going to call this function add. And what we want to do is we want to write a function that does the sum of two numbers. So you need to pass in a parameter. So far, we've only passed in one parameter, but a function can take in more than one parameter and more than one argument. So I'm going to pass in a parameter called a and b, like that. And what I want this function to do, I want it to return the sum of these two numbers. So for it to do that, I'm going to use a return keyword, and we're going to give it what it's going to return, which is a plus b, like that. So once it returns a plus b, then what you'll do at the end is we can try and call this function, right? So I'm going to call this function add, and we'll give it the two numbers. So let's say you want it to add a number like 3 and 6. If we call this function, we just save this for ourselves first. Once we call it, you notice that we don't get any output. The reason we're not getting any output on our terminal here is because this function is not printing anything. It is just returning the value, right? So it's returning the value. For if you want to see the value, we have to print the value ourselves. So in that case, what you do is we can wrap this statement in a print function, or we can just declare another variable here called result, and then we'll print out this result. So you can just do print result. So if you print result like that and we run our code, now as you can see, we're getting the sum, which is 6, right? So again, you can always format this statement and say, can just say something like the sum is, and I'm going to pass in result there, and I'll close this. What have I done? Okay, I'm going to close that. Then if you run this, you see again the sum is 9. Again, you can format it however you'd like to. But in this case, the function returns the value. Now, this is where the difference comes in between return and print. Like you mentioned in a function, when a function prints something out, the function gets terminated immediately. It has executed everything. But when you use a return keyword, it means that the function still has that value. Basically, it still returns that value, still contains it. It's some sort of it's like it's holding the value hostage. So anytime you want that value, you have to ask that function to give you the value. So in such a case, the function does not get terminated. Yeah, so that does. So think of it. Okay, I don't want to use this example I want to use, but I hope that makes sense. So at this point, the return keyword tells the function that here's your output. Then without the return, the function will just run, but it won't give us a result back. So that's why we're doing the print right here. Now, let's go ahead and look at a few other things. We've seen how multiple parameters can be added to a function with a and b here in our add. We can go ahead and write another simple function to help us out here. So we can define another function. We can call it multiply. Let's call it multiply, and it's going to take in two parameters. We can just say x and y. Again, you can use any other variables. For example, you can just call them like num1 and num2, like the parameter names here, and it's going to return the multiplication of num1 and num2. So that is so let's do that, that should be num1. Then use the asterisk sign as we know there, num2. That's what it returns. And from here, we can call the function multiply. Uh, so we can store this result, or we can just do a simple print statement and we call the multiply in here. So we're going to call multiply into, so let's call it multiply. Then we're going to pass in the num1 and num2, let's say 2 and 80. So if we run this, you'll see we get 160 down here. So this is what you get. Deprecation warning, audio loop is removal. Okay, yeah, it's okay. It's just a warning, but we're good. So now we're getting this. We can see how we can basically use multiple parameters, but at times there is also cases where, and we're going to see this when you look at, for example, object-oriented programming, but they're what we refer to as default values in functions. So when you're writing a function, sometimes you need to give it a default value. And why we need this default value is because at times you want your function to be flexible and you want it to still execute even if it does not have an argument, right? So for example, right now, if we try and for in this function here, if we, let's say we just call multiply like that, it is going to give us an error. So let's run it again. You still get an error and it tells us multiply missing 2 required original arguments. You can see all these things here, right? So what you can do in this case is we can go ahead and give it a default value. So default value is, for example, saying name, and you basically define and initialize everything here. So you can just say num1 is, let's say, 2. Then you can say num2 is 1, like that. Or you can even just call it 1. So at any point, in what this is going to mean is, even if you don't give me an argument, I'm still going to print out a value regardless. If we run this and see, you'll see we get 1 at the end here, right? So we're getting this 1 because we have default values. But if we go ahead and still give it some arguments, let's say 23 and 10, it's going to now take these arguments. These arguments are going to have a higher precedence over the default values that we defined during our function definition. If we run this, so you can see we get 230 as the output here. Again, I do hope this makes sense up to this point. I know it's a lot. This can be a bit overwhelming because we are basically looking at multiple concepts on how functions work. But feel free to just go back and try to look at everything again at the same time. So I need to remove this here. Okay, let's run this again. Awesome. So we're getting our output. I think the input just was added as a auto completion earlier on. So now this is what functions are. Just a common sort of like gotcha moments, or rather values and concepts in Python. For example, sometimes when you're calling a function, you might forget using the parentheses. So for example, if we're going to talk about, let's say, okay, let's use the one that we've talked about before. For example, here, greet. When you're calling greet, wait, this is where we're doing the function call. Okay, let me just do this, and I just want to do that. Awesome. Now, when you're calling the greet function, sometimes you can forget either giving it an argument and it needed the argument. So that's something to always watch out for. Or at times when you're calling, some people would call it without passing the parentheses, which is going to cause an error at the end. So you always have to watch out for that. Let's just take it back to what it was. So that's one thing to always take out, or rather think about. Then when you're using the return keyword, sometimes we forget to use the return keyword when you want a function to return something. So also when you're getting errors, try to watch out for something like that. Sometimes we can also mix up parameters and arguments, right? So for example, this is what happens with parameters and arguments. I'm going to remove this default values that we have here. When this 23 value is the value of num1, and 10 is the value of num2. So at times you'll find yourself interchanging these values if you're not careful. Then you'll do 23. So some people might interchange this thinking that it's still going to pick 10 for num2 and this. So each position where you put in your argument is going to be the representative of the same position during rather than the parameters, or where the parameters was placed. So make sure that your parameters are inside the function, and make sure that arguments are always passed in. Make sure that your function is working well with the return keywords and all, and make sure that you always call your function. Now, from here, I do hope you've been able to understand what you've done up to this point. I'm going to give you a simple challenge, and I'd like you to just pause at this point to try out the challenge. I'd like you to just use I use multi-line comments to write this one down. So the challenge is for you to write a function. So write a function, and you can call a function. You say call square, and this function is going to take in a parameter called num. Then this function returns it. This function returns the square of a number. So this is your challenge. You can pause at this point and try it out. If you are having issues understanding what you mean by it giving a square of a number, feel free to refer back to when you're talking about operators, and how to do arithmetic operations in Python. You might get a bit of a hint from there. So do pause and try it out. Okay, so if you've tried that out, I hope you've been able to get the right answer, but I'm going to just try it out as well here for you to see what is expected. So you need to define a function, call it square, like you've mentioned there, then give it a parameter, in this case num, and then finally it needs to return the square. So for you to return the square, what you need to do is you can just do num and then multiplied by num. This is one way to do it. So you can just say num multiplied by num, like that. So you can do it like that. Then you can try to print out the output here from this. So I can just say the square should be as there. So we'll just say the square is, and we pass in the num. Okay, so I'm going to call this result. So I'll just call it result. And then we have a result variable up there. I'll call it maybe output, something like that. And then I'm going to define a output function here. You don't have to go through all these steps that I'm going through, but I'm just doing this so that it's a bit clear. You call the square function, and you pass in a value like 30. You can also add an input function there to be getting the input from a user. But if you run this, it says, okay, let me just do that roughly. You see it says the square is 900. That is the square of 30, as you can see there. So this is what was expected, but you can expand it even further to fit what you'd like to do. Awesome. Now that you've confirmed whether you've gotten the right thing and you've been able to make the right adjustments to the solution that you provided, I'd like to add you just some more tasks that you can go and do. Then once you do them, feel free to just let us know your output or your result in the comments below. So the first one I want to do is write a function that adds up three numbers. So note that we've talked about how you can pass in a single argument, two arguments. So you can try and experiment with three arguments. Then I'd also like you to write a function that checks if a number is even. So far we know how to spot even numbers from the previous task. Then I'd also like you to write a function that takes two strings and prints those two strings combined. So I'd like you to do this and let us know the results that you get from here. And that is going to be it for now. I'm going to give you another challenge to do during the evening session, rather in the next lecture. And all the best.